So good afternoon, everyone, to those of you who are here at the European University Institute, and also to those of you who are joining us online. Welcome to this MPC seminar, which will be about a new data set, an important new data set about border crossings between 243 countries. And it is my pleasure to welcome here Ettore Recchi, who is a part-time professor at the Migration Policy Center and also a professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Tobias Grohmann and Luca Bernasconi, who are research fellows and research associates at the Migration Policy Center. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our three presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenka. Thank you, everybody, for joining this seminar. I'm very pleased to introduce our work. But before we dive into data, figures, and maps, and there will be a lot, you will see, I would like to put this project into context. This data set that we are presenting today is part of a rather unique venture that was started at MPC in 2018, the Global Mobilities Project, which tries to put together and analyze data sets that speak about different aspects of global transnational mobility with a typical country-to-country approach and a worldwide scope. From 2019, we have released 4 major data sets. The first one, it's a global transnational mobility data set, which is the first incarnation, so to speak, of a more extended data set that we'll be presenting today, reporting the volumes of travelers across countries worldwide. The second one is the global visa cost data set that includes the cost of all or almost all visas that are required to travel worldwide. The third one was created during the COVID crisis, and it reports weekly health and travel indicators between actually more than 500 subnational areas of 46 countries in 2020. And the fourth one is a border permeability data set, which contains indicators of all connecting infrastructures along borders, again, worldwide. All these data sets are freely downloadable from the Global Mobilities Project page at MPC. What we introduce today is a refresh and a much expanded version of our poster child, the Global Transnational Mobility Dataset. We have some methodological innovations, and we have a much extended coverage. The first version only had 6 years. Now we have 27 years of coverage from 1995 till 2022, and 243 countries. Why study global mobility, and particularly in a migration-oriented research center? Our general idea is that the broad and umbrella notion of mobility is more neutral than migration, and so it escapes, in a sense, the risk of categorization that are part and parcel of a migration concept. So studying mobility as a normative rationale, because it sets aside the prevailing image of migrants as a separate outgroup in society, and rather thinks of mobility as a general phenomenon that is widespread and common to all social groups. It also has a descriptive rationale because it brings us to incorporate in the analysis the large variety of cross-border experiences that fall beyond, or that go beyond the stricter conventional definition of migration. At the end of the day, our data set provides the statistical big picture, the backdrop of global population movements, independently of state-based classifications of mobile people. What mobility are we talking about? A bit provocatively, last year, Lorenzo Piccoli and others published a rather influential paper in sociology, which contains this statement: it remains impossible to demarcate when mobility begins and could be legitimately categorized as a mobile individual. Philosophically, this might be true, but pragmatically, we solve the issue by using the following operationalization. For us, transnational mobilities is any episode of border crossing by human beings. That's what matters to us. And this narrows down, in a sense, our task. So we record transnational travels in terms of border crossings. I also want to highlight that we have a preference for transnational over international, following a tradition in international relations where transnational refers to sub-state actions or activity of sub-state actors, whereas international reserved to state relations. And we speak about episodes, that is action, border crossings, not people. So the figures that you will see do not speak about the number of people. They speak about the number of border crossings. We draw on existing sources, although we merge them in a rather original way, and we'll spend some time explaining this. These sources speak about two categorized population. One is visitors, that is travelers who do not change their place of residence when crossing borders. We don't care about the reasons why people are considered to be visitors by existing statistical information systems. And migrants, that is travelers who change their place of usual residence. And in this, we follow the conventional definition by the UN as used by national and international statistical offices. In the following, the origin country is always the country of origin of individual travel. So it's not the nationality of travelers, nor the country of birth of travelers. And our data set contains cells, observations, actually 1.2 million observations over the 27 years, that consist of what we call corridor year. That is information about the number of travelers from one origin to a destination in any given year. So for instance, people crossing the border between Germany and Austria in 2019. We tap two different existing sources. We tap administrative data on international arrivals at borders, what we call in the following TRIPS A, which consists of visitors, returning visitors, former visitors that go back to the country of residence, and migrants. And then we tap a different source, which is less frequently used in mobility and migration research, which is transport data. That is data about the number of passengers of carriers. We call these TRIPS B, and they can be reported by air carriers, land carriers, railways, buses, also theoretically private vehicles, and water carriers like cruisers or ferries. What is in these lines? This simple equation by which TRIPS A equals TRIPS B. It may look trivial, but it's key to the kind of data manipulation that follow, because the data, the administrative data and the transport data that we will use have gaps. And we use the equivalence by filling out the gaps with either one or the other of the two sources. So I hand it to Tobias, who will delve into the methods of data integration.
Yes, thank you, Ettore. I'm going to go now through the process of assembling our data set. And I begin with the sources that we're using. Ettore has alluded to them already. There are three main sources. The first source is the UNWTO inbound tourism statistics. The UNWTO is the World Tourism Organization by the United Nations. And from this source, we use figures on incoming international tourists and visitors. The second source that we use are migration flow estimates between 230 countries, and we use estimates by Guy Abel. The third source are air passenger volumes that we take from Sabre. Sabre is a private company who provides data and services for for airlines and airports. As you see, the air passenger volume data covers only the period from 2010 to 2022, whereas the other two sources cover longer time periods, and we will, as I explain later, fill in the missing values with a technique that we call backcasting. Okay, given these sources of raw data, I will now walk through the process of assembling the mobility estimates that we get from them. And you will see that the theoretical and conceptual considerations that Ettore already presented, they will come back in this exercise. We divide our process in two major steps, and I will walk you through. I am not sure if I can do that. I'll keep talking. Maybe we need to expand it. Oh,
Wait.
yeah, yeah, perfect. Right. Thank you. All right. Where was I? Okay, so we have a two-step process, and what you see here is the first step of this process. It involves getting from the raw data sources on the top of the slide towards estimates of trips A and trips B. Remember, trips A represent the border crossings measured through administrative data, and trips B is border crossings measured through transportation data. The second step, which follows after that, involves combining trips A and trips B into our estimates. Before we do that, though, I'll zoom in on the left-hand side and the right-hand side part of this process here. All right, so regarding our administrative data, we noted earlier that the people crossing a country's border in an inward direction are international visitors and returning residents that have been international visitors elsewhere before, and immigrants. So basically, we have to get figures for each of these groups and add them up. And this will give us the total border crossings for a year according to these administrative sources. So we start with international visitors. And we get this, as we said earlier already, from the UNWTO. However, tourist arrivals are reported in different categories by the reporting countries. Some report visitors, which include also daily excursionists. Others report overnight tourists. Some countries report by nationality. Others report by country of residence of the arriving persons. So to make these categories all comparable to each other, we harmonize them and translate them into one category, namely visitors. And this process we depict in this figure here. Note that we try to collapse everything on this one category, highlighted in green on the top right. This is so the focus on visitors is a departure from the first version of the global transnational mobilities dataset, which focused more on tourists rather than visitors. So that's a methodological evolution. Then, once we have our international visitors, we add the returning visitors. And these are just the reverse flows of the visitor outflows in the opposite direction. And finally, we add migration flows or the corresponding migration flows. And this yields then in total our total border crossings in a corridor year observation. All right, so with this in mind, this is TRIPS A. Let's move to TRIPS B, the measure of border crossings that uses transport data. For the transport data, we use air passenger volumes. However, we should note that these passenger volumes approximate total border crossings better the larger the distance between countries. The intuition is relatively simple. If countries are far away from each other, the only real mode of transport between them is the airplane. Once countries are closer together, other modes of transport are available too, such as cars and boats, etc., etc. So to account for this, we apply a distance correction to these air passenger volumes. And the idea, again, is from the GTMD1, so the first version of the data set. However, we improve a bit on the methodology here. And in contrast to the previous version, we don't only focus on distance between countries, but also contiguity, landlockedness, and whether countries are island states. And from this, we basically get an accessibility factor between countries, and we adjust the air passenger volumes using this accessibility factor. Okay, so this distance correction then, or accessibility correction, completes the first step of the data assembling process. We have now TRIPS A and TRIPS B, and now we combine them together, and this is actually super simple. So based on the assumption that TRIPS A and TRIPS B are equivalent, as Ettore said, we combine them and we use whichever one is available to us. And if they are both available, we use the one that is largest. And this step completes the final estimates of cross-border mobility. Eventually, however, we provide two different series of estimates, and series 1 is a simple version which uses TRIPS A and TRIPS B as described just now. Series 2 is a bit more extensive, and we try to maximize the coverage of our data set with this. In particular, we backcast TRIPS B before putting TRIPS A and TRIPS B together. We also do some data, some missing data imputation, but this is not a large exercise. Remember that the passenger volumes that I introduced earlier were available only from 2010 onwards, and we use backcasting to impute values in the years 2009, 8, 7, etc., until we arrive in 1995, so that we have a complete coverage in our data period. Okay. So this operation increases our coverage considerably. Talking about coverage, we have a table here that tells you about the coverage, and it compares series 1 and series 2. However, I want to draw your attention to one set of figures, and this is this one. So in series 2, which represents our main estimates, we achieve a coverage of 80% of all possible corridor year observations that we have in our matrix. In total, there are 1.5 million, roughly, possible observations in the matrix, and we can cover 1.2 million of them. That is quite extensive. Okay. Having now assembled this large data set, we now want to share some figures and graphs which summarize the information that is in the data set. So we're going to see results. Our main graph, our main result is potentially this. Here we see the development of transnational mobility according to our series 2 estimates over time, where for each year we computed the annual total of border crossings by world region. According to our estimates, in 1995, there were 4.87 billion border crossings per year. This number goes up to 9.64 billion in 2019. And so we basically see a doubling of international mobility in that time. For a comparison, the world population in that time grew from 5.7 to 7.7 billion people. Of course, with the COVID-19, we see a big drop in global mobility. The number of border crossings dropped below 1995 levels. And we see afterwards in the year 2022, we see a recuperation of mobility again. Although it does not reach the 2019 levels yet. I think newer figures in 2023 show that we are almost back. The region with the largest amount of border crossings is Europe, here in orange. It is followed by Eastern and Southeastern Asia in light blue. Yeah. All right. So now we zoom in a little bit more into the regions and into the development of this data. Here we have a graph which shows the mobility growth rates by region with respect to 1995 levels. And this graph shows most of the action happens in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. And mobility in that region more than triples in the time from 1995 to 2019. But not only does it grow the most, they also experienced the largest drop during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they do not recover as quickly in terms of growth rates as other regions. Okay, moving on. What we can also do is to compare global mobility in terms of intra-regional and inter-regional flows. And this is what we're doing here in this graph. This comparison between the two graphs shows that intra-regional border crossings outnumber inter-regional trips vastly. The two scales are the same on the left and the right side. Judging from the slopes also of the curves, the growth of intra-regional travel is higher than that of inter-regional travel. One conclusion from this could be that global mobility and mobility growth is largely driven by intra-regional mobility, mostly in Europe, we have to say. We see again the big orange blob in the middle of the graph. We speculate that this has to do with increased integration in Europe. However, this is up to further investigation by everyone in the scientific community. Moreover, we could conclude, and this is not a new observation, globalization is in fact actually regionalization. So people do not travel truly globally inter-regions, but only more intra-regionally. And this has been documented already earlier in the earlier version of this data set and in other sources. A final observation that we can do with our data set that I want to talk about is to compare migration and total mobility. Migration here, we use the migration flows from Guy Abel that we showed earlier. And this graph shows that migration flows constitute only a fraction of a % on average of total mobility. For instance, in Europe, there are only 0.15% of border crossings by migrants. Some regions share somewhat larger flow, the shares are somewhat larger, but these are regions with larger countries and therefore fewer borders between them. So that may account for this. Okay, this concludes my exploration of the data set, and I hand over to Luca, who presents results from a different angle with different tools.
So having had a cursory look at the data set, we can try to see whether we can uncover some of the structural features of global mobility more inductively. Of course, since our data set features unit-to-unit flows of people, we are really in fact working with network data, and therefore we can apply some preliminary social network analysis. So what you see here are all the country-to-country flows with an underlying world map, and the nodes, which represent states, are placed in respective capitals of each country. The idea here is that we want to identify clusters or communities using a community detection algorithm. The Louvain method is used here. And here the communities are visualized by colors. Node sizes are determined by a centrality measure called PageRank, which is a measure of influence of particular nodes. You can't really see it, but the flows, the lines are also weighted by the size of the flows. So we have a snapshot of the network at particular points in time. This is 1995. We have 9 clusters, North and South American clusters, East and West Africa, the British Isles, the Western European cluster, a Eurasian cluster, MENA community, and last, Southeast Asian cluster. Moving through the decades, we can see there's a great deal of stability over time in the network, with clusters remaining broadly similar. However, upon closer examinations, some key shifts are noticeable. So let me list some of the key observations we make from the graphs now. Perhaps most saliently, the Latin American cluster, which is initially on its own, merges with the North in 2010. And I can show you this right here. You can see it forms a single cluster after 2010. The Americans then form sort of a single mobility system, the core of which is the United States. Over time, the Western European continent consistently has the biggest nodes and thus the highest transnational mobility flows, with countries like Germany, France playing key roles. This points to the high levels of proximity, but also of interconnectedness between European countries in the cluster, which broadly corresponds to EU membership action. It's worth noting, however, that Scandinavian and Baltic states are not part of this cluster, but of a Eurasian cluster until the late 2010s, when they form this kind of a distinct cluster from Russia and Central Asia, with which they were connected prior. There is a cluster that revolves around the UAE and expands eastwards over time to include South Asian countries. Some Balkan countries, most notably Turkey, are on the fringe of the cluster. They enter and exit it. The Caucasian states slowly integrate the space as well. Interestingly, what was initially a MENA cluster actually becomes less so over time. So here you can see the North African states are part of a MENA cluster, but after that, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, they joined the West African cluster. The British Isles are consistently grouped together, but behave erratically over time, sometimes being integrated with Western Europe, sometimes being on their own. As of 2022, they form a separate cluster that includes a few further states due to tourist flows. Last but not least, maybe we can go back one. China forms the backbone of the Southeast Asian cluster. However, Malaysia becomes the hub in 2022, since Chinese transnational mobility was still recovering from travel restrictions due to the pandemic. Having discussed some of these preliminary structural features of the data, we just want to lay out some brief caveats about the data set. The first being that the GTMD inherits some of the limitations of its underlying data sources, which themselves can be incomplete or exhibit discrepancies across geographies. Also important to note, irregular cross-border flows are not accounted for either, for instance. And yeah, also we want to maximize our coverage, be as broad as possible in our estimations. And sometimes this comes at the cost of accuracy in specific corridor years. Our aims are less to eliminate these biases than to get a reliable depiction of global trends and structural shifts in transnational mobility, as we've briefly presented today. I'll leave it to Ettore to conclude.
Yeah, I conclude very briefly because we are late on schedule. We think we are presenting a data set that is highly plastic and lends itself to a lot of potential applications in different fields, not only migration and mobility research. It can be of use to globalization scholars in international relations, but also international economics, relating human cross-border flows with other transnational flows. It lends itself to research about the environment and sustainability because of the impact of travel on the environment. It lends itself to work in epidemiology. Actually, the previous version of a data set was used at times by epidemiologists trying to explain or predict the spread of COVID during the pandemic. On our end, what we want to do next is to use this data to explore better the relationship between global mobility, socioeconomic development, and inequalities in the realm of a MIC-MOPS project. And I'm glad that Adrian Favell, who is the PI of this project, is with us today. We will particularly explore and try to devise also indicators on mobility inequality as still another dimension of global inequalities. We are working with a preliminary version of a transnational mobility Gini index. And we are also working with other partners of a MIGMOBS team to explore the political economy of regional mobility systems, in particularly in Latin America and Southeast Asia, exploring how the evolution of mobility flows goes hand in hand with institutional changes and specificity. But we are very keen on listening to questions and insights and comments from the audience in this occasion. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ettore, Tobias, and Luca, for this great presentation. And I now open the floor for questions. Maybe we collect first questions here in the room, but those of you who are online, please feel free to write your question in the chat, or maybe you can even raise your hand and we can listen to you, but or you can also just type it in the chat and I can read it for you. So if I open the floor, and does anyone have any questions?
Thanks for the excellent presentation and interesting project as well. So I'm Hiro, I'm a Max Weber Fellow at MPC. So I have a couple of questions. So the first thing is a little bit a big one, but I just, could it possible to offer some strict definition of the mobility? What do you mean by the mobility? If I understand correctly, mobility is almost synonymous with the border crossing, the movement of people, but people coming from different disciplines use the term the mobility in different ways. So Lorenzo may be better to expand on a little bit, but I just wonder what you exactly mean by the mobility. So there's no explanation in the paper, but because you are selling the paper as a mobility data under this project, so I think it'd be better to maybe just put one paragraph about what mobility exactly means in this context. And then, second ways is a kind of definition of the visitor and the migrant. So I know how you define this category, but I just curious to know how you arrive this definition, because I mean, based on the definition you cite in the paper, it's not exactly the same as we normally use in the like a UN statistic, or like most of the scholarship defines a migrant and visitor in a different way. But I just wonder what the rationale behind using this one. And probably, if I understand correctly, the visitor and the migrant, it's almost kind of the mutually exclusive category, right? Because you aggregate the trips based on the number of the visitor and the migrant. But is it really the case? I mean, because basically the classification based on the residency, but people sometimes can keep the kind of dual residency. Then there isn't there any side of risk of kind of overcounting certain type of the travel? I'm not sure if it's the case or not, but I'm a little bit curious about why using this category. And then a small question is about why the main unit of the measurement is set as a corridor year, and why because you can measure the like a direction of the travel, so why you count is basically focusing on the corridor and aggregate measure. And then, yeah, I have a little bit of minor comment, but we can talk later, maybe.
So if you agree, we collect two more, and then you can answer directly to three questions. So we now have Andrew and Lorenzo, and then we go for the next one.
Thanks. I've always wondered what you've been doing down there in that office at the end of the corridor. Quite alarming, really, what's going on. But anyway, congratulations. All these overheating computers in there. So I think, I mean, the data are fascinating, and about the point about regionalization. I mean, Emmanuel and Ettore have already kind of looked at that, and I mean, obviously, it's very convincing that what we're showing is regionalization, not globalization. So I was wondering if there's anything, and you talk about interest in the political economy of regional mobility systems, but have you anything to say about the relationship between regionalization and regionalism in the kind of these hubs or clusters that you're identifying? Because as soon as I look, particularly when Luca was presenting these, the mapping, you're looking there at actually existing regional organizations. I can see in West Africa, Southern Africa, South America, very different kinds of regional systems. What's the relationship over, or are you able to say something? Is that what you mean when you talk about the political economy of regional mobility systems? Do you have any initial kind of thinking about this? Are you able to, because if you've got the data over time, you've also got to develop these systems over time. You know, do you have any kind of working hypothesis to inform your analysis of regionalism and regionalization? And the second question I was interested in was, and perhaps it will be an issue you develop, is the relationship to the political meaning of mobility in these different hubs and clusters. Because we know that in some of those that were identified, mobility, however defined, has acquired very significant political meaning and has been represented as a dividing line, a structural fault in political systems, but with very different patterns of politicization in other clusters and hubs that you identify. And I think and the integration of data on political attitudes could be very interesting because of the patterns of comparative politicization. Certainly in Europe, there's a huge amount of work on migration and mobility as a dividing line. So I suppose it's really thinking about what you say at the end there, whether you've got any thoughts on this at the moment. Thanks.
Lorenzo.
Thank you, Lorenzo.
You're going to hurt yourself.
Thank you, Lorenzo, said the Migration Policy Center. Fascinating stuff, finding. I know they're very preliminary. I have one question, maybe that's very boring, because it's on whether you managed to capture also people who are just in transit through the country. And then I have, it's not really a question, but I wanted to tell you something that I found really intriguing in what you said, and that's for example, the quick growth of Southeastern Asia. I was wondering if you have an explanation for that, and I was wondering if that's something that you want to do more research on. You suggest that, maybe linking to the question by Andrew, one of the drivers for greater mobility intra-regional is, of course, political aggregation, so Schengen in Europe, but maybe another reason can also be the development of very ambitious infrastructure. I wonder whether there was a case for Malaysia, for example, some of your South American hubs, of course, changes in the UAE, and then in Eastern Africa, for example, where I know there have been massive investments, for example, by Ethiopian Airlines. And finally, again, just speculating, very interesting discussion on, I don't remember if Luca used the term fringe clusters or clusters that move from one region to the other. And again, I wonder whether that's something which you want to conduct research on in the future. You mentioned Turkey and a few others. And there again, I'd be very curious to understand what the reasons for those shifts are, and whether they are only politically driven, as seems to be on your mind now, or whether there might be also economic reasons, and they might be business driven, for example. Right, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, so if you would like to answer now, quite a lot of questions.
Yes. I mean, the basic unit is border crossing. That's the title of the paper at the end of the day. So mobility for us is transnational mobility, and it's episodes, that is a border crossing by human being. Then these come as aggregates. So once you look into the data set, you don't find individual data, you find aggregates, you find numbers that correspond to the volume, to the numbers of episodes of border crossings between Germany and Austria in 2019. So these are building blocks. Migration, I take your point. So we take existing statistics on immigration under the assumption, there is an assumption that we didn't mention, that the episodes of immigration in a country equate with the number of newly arriving immigrants. So there may be some double counting there, because these people may come and go and be recorded as visitors and immigrants. We take this risk. This is one of our limitation. And citizenship, we are totally agnostic about citizenship. We don't care. We don't cover citizenship. It's all about movement from country A to country B. I start responding to
I can take the last point. Yeah, but corridor year refers to a directional measure, actually. So we actually don't provide a dyadic data set, but really a directional data set from point A to point B. So that's...
Put the mic on.
Yeah.
In the final output, there is no direction, right? Because I mean, directional data is more informative than non-directional data. So
No,
But it is
no, it is
directional.
that what we're saying is it is directional. It is directional.
But I mean, in the analysis, like you don't care about which direction people moving or not. No.
So actually, we do, but there is some symmetricity in the data insofar as we add returning visitors. So inevitably, you will see very similar figures depending on the direction you go, because...
Yeah, so I understand. So I'm not asking what are you doing. I'm asking about the rationale of doing so.
What's the rationale of doing this? Because we assume that
That is my question.
Yeah, we assume that visitors who have a usual residence in country A come back to country A. So there is a border crossing in one direction and there is a border crossing returning. I don't think this is a very daring assumption.
But since there are also people who do not return quickly, but then count as a residence changer, we need to take this directionality into account. That's the rationale. So there are people who return and some who don't. And this is why we need to have directional data. Because the flows in the one direction might be bigger than the ones in the other direction.
But unless people don't change the residency, so like if you a country moving from country A to country B and staying there for over a year, but they don't change the residency, and then they suddenly he or she is coming back. And
Okay, so but that's an empirical point.
Yeah,
about
empirical
whether or
point.
not
Maybe I
countries
can kind of
register.
lead to another point, maybe, but like a time scale of the return migration, it might be you want to take into account at certain stage, because it's probably like how you define like a data migration. It might be a little bit tricky. I mean, I understand like how it's important to make things clear to create the data, but it's a little bit like conceptual kind of vagueness surrounding what you're doing, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe on this point we are just limited by the data available. So we work with what we have.
We assume that states are quite adamant in distinguishing visitors from migrants. So people say, yeah, we are not covering. We said that we are not covering irregular migrants. Yeah, that's one of the limitations of a data set. Yeah,
because a person.
I want to move to other questions, otherwise we don't manage to cover. Andrew's point about regionalization, yes, definitely this resonates a lot with Manuel Deutschmann's work, and it goes exactly in the direction of what we want to do next. We want to dig deeper into regions and, for instance, use the data set that Diego Acosta and Luc van Baren and others put up on free movement regimes in different regions, and see whether the 30 different indicators of free movement that they have compiled have an effect on mobility differently over time in the different regions. So this is really the kind of analysis that fits well with what we have in mind. and working also with the associates in the MIGMOX project from Latin America and South Asia, we intend to supplement these political institutional data also with other economic or institutional data that may be relevant in shaping flows over time.
There was a
short question
about
about attitudes and the meaning of mobility. I don't know if I want to monopolize the answer.
Oh, no. I don't really have much to say on that point. Oh, I wanted to go to Lorenzo's question already. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. But maybe you can take Lorenzo's point.
Yes, a quick point on transit and whether this is captured. Okay, so we have, of course, the two different sets or sets of data or sources of data that we tap in the administrative data and the transport data. In the transport data, the data set that we use is actually transit is not in there, and we actually don't mind that transit journeys are not in there because typically people do not meaningfully interact with the country or economic market or society when they transit on a trip. Also in the administrative data, it is not in there. Potentially, if people change their residence for a long enough time, they may appear in the migrant data and as a transit migrant, but then they have to, but then they are actually counted as two different migration episodes. One residence change, and then they stay for a while in the country and then move further, then that would be, yeah, that's what I come to say about transit. And then you were asking about factors or drivers of mobility, if I understand correctly. And I mean, we are at the beginning of our all kinds of analyses of this data, and we want to look in all of these drivers possible. So that ranges from political drivers that with integration, etc., that we mentioned, but also economic drivers as well as other social economic drivers. Yeah.
So we take your point, and we're gonna go into that.
Yeah, I think these investments in large infrastructure project are actually is quite a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the same question regarding the fringe regions. These are, of course, as a result of the sort of network analysis that we do. These are the longitudinally. These are the points that are the most interesting, more than the constant blocks of regions. So these are the ones that where we see some heterogeneity over time, and we will try to maybe model. I also wanted to say regarding Andrew's point on, so this is a macro level data set, of course, we're non-individualized. One thing we've been discussing is that within the MIGMOX project, we can try to supplement it with some national household mobility surveys for some European countries, for instance, and then sort of, yeah, reconcile these two visions of mobility, hopefully. Yeah.
I wanted to add something about Europe, which looks like, I mean, one of the most, for me, outstanding and surprising results is that whereas Europe is the largest block in the map, it's not united. So the EU is not a cluster. The EU is broken down into a continental Germany-centered block, and then the Scandinavia-Baltic area, and then an area with Greece that gravitates rather towards the British islands. And Ireland, even after Brexit, stays close to the UK rather than moving towards continental Europe. So the free movement regime exists, is there, it maybe boosts mobility within Europe, but the EU is not a monolith.
One also point about Southeast Asia regarding Lorenzo's question is simply an economic question of increasing means from travelers. So it could be driven in part by the UNWTO data, where you have some regional tourism going on on that continent because of the massive growth of probably China since joining the UNWTO in 2001. So yeah, this is one story beyond just the hard facts of infrastructure that you correctly mentioned. That's very interesting, actually. Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to move to another set of questions and to take the questions online now. So, for example, I have seen Thomas's hand for quite a while. Hello, Thomas. Nice to see you in this setting.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic. So first of all, congratulations from us here in Copenhagen. We have a few people here with us from the Global Mobility Law Center at the University of Copenhagen. And it was really nice to see the project progressing from when we last talked to you about it and together with Ettore and Adrian this autumn. Now, I had sort of two half questions, half reflections. And the first one is actually a direct response to your answer to Andrew's. And it comes back to this issue around regionalization. And yes, of course, you could say this supports regionalization, but what I found really astonishing, just from the Pew panel examples that you showed, is the degree of dynamism that is going on here. And that to me at least suggests that there's something else than sort of stable regional or spatial constraints going on. So together with Christian Preiner, we've just, I think next week there'll be a paper out in German Law Journal trying to sort of prove a little bit of a correction to Ettore's and Deutschmann's hypothesis around regionalization. Say, well, how to think about law, for instance, as one example of a confounding variable. And I guess, so Luke van Baren, who's also working here with us, and the data set you mentioned previously might also be a kind of confounding variable in terms of saying, well, how might this sort of skew the pictures? How might normative, political, economic changes kind of provide for this dynamism? I'd love to hear your reflections on that. The second very brief kind of question reflection was around, I mean, the mobility data that you showed, the aggregate data and the sort of, again, the dynamisms in regional clustering. I mean, to me at least, it really highlights a quite different picture from what a lot of the UN agencies seems to be presenting in and around migration mobility. Yeah. So, I mean, I was part of a seminar with IOM discussing their recent World Migration Report, and they are relying solely on flight data for kind of also looking at, for instance, post-COVID recovery since 2019. And I think, I mean, there you get a very different picture from what you just presented. Yeah. So you see like like recovery plus in airplane mobility in North America, quite a significant drop, etc. But what we're lacking is exactly this more fine-grained picture vis-a-vis other types of specialized travel. But also, I think very importantly, the regionalization dynamic that might help explain things like recruitment crisis going on in different parts of the world. So I'd love to hear if you've sort of taken steps at sort of kind of relating this data back to some of the more recent things coming out from other organizations. Thanks a lot.
So I'm also going to read some other questions we have in the chat and to collect them. So another question we got is how compatible is the methodology and structure of the data set in terms of, for example, doing comparative analysis with other available data sets? So that was one question. Then we had a question that it seems that the unit of analysis is years, or it's yearly. So the question was whether you could have also the unit of analysis in month or days, if that would be possible. And then we have a final question from our online audience, which asks, what is the main objective of the study, bearing in mind that no nationalities and reasons for travel is recorded?
Can you repeat that?
Yes. What is the main objective of the study, bearing in mind that no nationalities and reasons for travel is recorded? So I think that's quite a big philosophical.
It's kind of a loaded question, isn't it?
What's the bigger picture here?
I'm respecting any question is plausible, but
I would say the question is, what's the bigger picture here? Anyways. So if you would like to answer these online questions, and maybe we will even manage one more round because I saw some other questions.
I could just answer the year question. The data is yearly. Some of our underlying data is at the monthly level, but we don't disclose that. It's a yearly data set. And I'm sure it's comparable with other yearly data sets at the national level or subnational level, which can then be aggregated. Yeah. Oh, I maybe I didn't understand the comparability question. Is it a question about robustness?
So
No, it's about the aggregation. All the data are of the country we use the standard ISO classification, so it can be relatively easily merged with other existing data set, for instance, on trade or any other possible international data set. So it's made on purpose to be flexible and plugged into other data sets.
Yeah, I think there was a clarification on what actually counts as mobility.
Okay, so now I see another question. Did the distance correction you applied provide any interesting insights on its own? For example, the higher proportion of island nations in Oceania correlating with preponderance of air travel by visitors from that region. Additionally, it seems there would be difficulty accounting for travel by nationals from distant regions, such as people from Greenland who have Danish passports, people from Guadeloupe who have French passports, and so on and so forth. How are such travelers categorized in your methodology?
Well, since it's border crossings, well, so they will be captured in two different ways. On the one hand, in the transport data, they will be just as travelers on a plane or whatever mode of transport they use between those countries. Well, in the tourism-derived data, it will be their country of residence as the origin country and the country of destination wherever they check in, so to speak. We admit that there might not be complete overlap, and that might create differences between those two sources, the transportation data and the administrative data. So I think, yeah.
Most of our units are sovereign states, but some of our units are not, are territories. So for instance, Greenland is separate. And so we take any movement, any border crossing from Greenland to Denmark or to any other country as a border crossing. Guadeloupe is in fact considered as part of France. So I think that, isn't it? Is it? No, I'm wrong. No, just double check. So much depends on the categorization of the territories. I should know about Guadeloupe. Shame on me.
Yeah, the standard is the M49 from the UN. So I defer to that, but Tobias is
Guadeloupe is separate.
Okay, Guadeloupe is separate. So anybody traveling from Guadeloupe is considered as border crossing when landing onto Charles de Gaulle Airport. See another question.
Yeah,
I think that's fascinating.
there was
Okay, yes, fascinating stuff, amazing. So it's a very boring question, but I was wondering how sensitive your results were to your transport adjustment factor, because it seems quite a lot's riding on that, and particularly looking at the Europe results, where you've got both a lot of proximity, but also probably a lot of air travel. I mean, when I saw that, I didn't think European integration, I thought Ryanair, when I saw your increase, with the supply side being as important potentially as the demand side. So I just wondered whether you've done, and of course it's very complicated in Europe because, you know, they're like the people who commute into Luxembourg and out of it. But I was wondering whether you've done sort of checks or how much it did matter. I mean, maybe not that much rides on it.
Could just say something very quick, because obviously Ryanair is the effect of European integration. I mean, the liberalisation. I mean, there's but I mean that might be.
Just to some extent, yes, but yeah.
No, but I think those kind of regional liberalisation So yeah, it just kind of, I don't think they're separate things.
Okay, yeah. But it's also a supply side issue as well as a demand side, I would say. Yeah.
And we have one last question, and then you guys can answer everything together because we will run out of time. So maybe Lisa.
Thanks a lot for that, Lisa, you and you. I was wondering, maybe I missed this part, but it's related to the free movement regime. Maybe it's part of your next step. But if you're differentiating in your data between open borders, open border regimes and open border areas, if you somehow differentiate these areas from others.
Okay, this is quick, so I take it quickly. No, we don't differentiate for the moment. I mean, you can create some coding for more or less open borders, but that's what we intend to do by plugging our data set with the free movement hub data set by Diego Costa and Luc van Baren and the other collaborators. I want to say hi to Thomas, by the way, and thanks for your comments and insights. Maybe you can comment on what Linda said.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to say a few words to our distance correction. And here what you see is a comparison between the original air passenger data and the corrected data. The blue ones is the original data, and the other one, the red dots represent the corrected ones. And we see here arrivals in the United States in 2018. Picked a random place to arrive. And we see that some countries have been corrected upwards, or arrivals from some places have been corrected upwards, notably Canada and Mexico here. So there will be land border crossings from those places, and this has been taken care of. Other arrivals have been corrected downwards, but what we do is that we then use the whatever is largest. So if our correction corrects downwards, we use the larger ones from the air passenger data. What was exactly so? We
case studies where you can look at particular flows and say, does my correction factor match what I can see with the other data actually going on?
I refer to the appendix of our paper.
Paper copies of it.
There's a bit of testing, and we choose the correction that gives us still the highest number of observations, because if we are going too detailed, we lose a lot of observations, and especially that it correlates. We use the correction that correlates the most with the visitor data that we have. So from the other data source, from the administrative side of our data set. So that's a bit the trade-off that we do.
So I'm afraid we will have to stop here because we have run out of time. So thank you everyone for your engaging questions, those of you here and also to those of you online. And especially thanks a lot to Ettore, Luca and Tobias for this great presentation and for engaging with the questions and audience. So we are, everyone here at the MPC, we are very much looking forward to see you at our next seminar. Whenever that is, as Andrew says. So have a great day and bye-bye.